When you look at German history in the 20th century, there's no doubt that the Nazi era and the Holocaust are at the center of that history. And it's very important to explain how the Nazi crimes could happen. And so many researchers are working on that topic. But I think there's another topic that's also very important to look at and to understand, and that is, how can you explain that a country after 1945, which was made up of a people that had been majority Nazi and that had supported Nazism and also had been involved in the Nazi crimes, many of them, so relatively quickly then became a democracy which was working. And of course, this is also something that has impact over the case, beyond the case of Germany. And so, because of that, I was interested to look at the public sphere of the time, the mass media and journalism, political journalism in particular. And I wanted to explain how and when a critical political public sphere came about. One of the main findings was that there was huge continuity in political journalism, and that most journalists after 1945 and in the 50s and 60s had already been trained or had been working under the Nazis. And that denazification was at best a temporary success. I mean, it did take away the people who were most exposed, maybe a few hundred journalists at the very top, but all the rank and file basically came back into the profession. And in the 1950s, we actually have quite a stifling atmosphere, which I called consensus journalism, in which there's very little criticism of government, and journalists are kind of self-censoring to a large extent, and they are very anti-communist, and they're trying to ensure that there's like a general harmony, and that there's not too much political infighting in order to safeguard this new state, West Germany. Another finding was that actually this starts to change in the early 1960s, and that has to do with generational change. So there's a new generation of journalists coming in then, and they are comparatively very young, and I called them the 45ers. And 45ers means that 1945 was the turning point of their lives. They were still teenagers, or they were very young adults at that time, and most of them had actually been believers in National Socialism. But they were too young to actually have been tainted or have been part of the Nazi crimes. And when they learned about them, some of them dedicated themselves to make sure that this wouldn't happen again. And so they were actively working for the democratization of West Germany, and they understood their job as a journalist in this respect. So the 45ers were very important, and they were particularly important in television and radio of West Germany at the time, because there they could work together with a counter-elite, because the Allied denazification in the years after 1945 had basically not been able to change personnel very much in the print media, but there was a surviving counter-elite that the Allies had put into place, although it was embattled, but it was there in radio, and from that on later television. Another finding was that then in the late 1960s, when the student unrest came and when there was a lot more kind of appetite for politicized news, for critical reporting, also coming from audiences, then we have a younger generation of engaged, often socialist students who want to become journalists. And then these 45ers and the so-called 68ers, the ones who were involved in the student protests of the years around 1968, they worked together. So I credit basically these two generations with the pluralization and the opening up of the public sphere at the time in West Germany.